This is a can't miss episode. He's been operating self-storage for nearly 30 years in the biggest market in the country, and he's also heavily involved in facing the legislative challenges in New York City. Today on Stories Behind the Door podcast, the president of Cayre Equities, James Coakley. He's been deeply ingrained in Big Apple self-storage for nearly 3 decades. Through the dot-com bust, the GFC, COVID, the last 3 years of headwinds we've seen in the industry, he's literally been there for it all. The president of Cayre Equities, which is the operator of Treasure Island Storage, also the immediate past president of the New York Self-Storage Association, an organization he's still deeply involved in, especially on the legislative front, which is no small thing in today's environment. He is James Coakley. I'm going to get to him in a second. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Kiwi 2 Construction. I am actually looking out my window on 2 Kiwi steel guys putting in steel panels on a 3-story self-storage structure that is directly across the street from my house. Simply the best crews in self-storage and small bay flex for steel. Reach out to them early in a project if you have something going on at ground up. You will benefit from their 30 plus years of putting up steel. No further ado, he's James Coakley. First and foremost, I know how busy you are. Thank you so much for taking some time and coming and joining the podcast.
No, I appreciate it. That reaching out on the invitations. Very kind. I know I've been following you for a while now, and had a chance to meet in person, so it's been great. Although I think we have to do something with your starting image there, because wherever you got those are pretty good, because we both had a lot more hair.
Yeah, I haven't redone my headshot since I went bald. The comb over started creeping, and right. I just gave up a couple months ago. I appreciate that little induction of levity to start us off. I want to start with the question that I always start the podcast with. Storage is such a unique industry. It's such a niche industry. I have yet to meet anyone, even the people like John Lindsay and Alex Burnham, who were born into the industry, still didn't set out to have a career in the industry. How did James Coakley find himself working in self-storage?
Sure. No, 100%. Most of us probably didn't even know what it was when we first were introduced to it. So, it's funny. I got my start in my, career life working in wireless telecom, believe it or not. And I was kind of on the financial and supply chain side of things, and was looking to kind of make a move, and was just introduced, through a recruiter to a little company known as Edison Properties and Manhattan Mini Storage, and went in and met with a number of those folks, and just kind of hit it off, and was very fortunate to start my career in storage with them. I mean, obviously another family business, but really pioneers in the business, and really set the tone for what urban self-storage was and would now become as well.
You worked for Manhattan Mini Storage for a little bit. You went to United Store All, now, of course, part of CubeSmart. CubeSmart bought out a big chunk of that. Mm-hmm. How'd you end up at Cayre Equities? When did that happen? And what was that like?
Sure. So, I was working with the United Store All folks, Carol Shipley, the Manley family, started with some operations, then moved over to the real estate side, and was really first time I was dipped my toe into the development game, and learned some, was very fortunate to learn from some of the top people in the industry. And then, like a lot of people, 2007, 2008, 2009 came along, and deals started getting tougher and tougher to put together, and you had a growing family, and we needed to eat. So, was introduced to the Cayre family, who started the Treasure Island storage business back around 2004, 2005. And they were, again, another family office, family business, had really put together a number of, pretty nice projects, and, just weren't quite performing as to what I think they originally thought they were. They were more the investment guys, and were relying on some others to run the day-to-day. I was introduced to them like we all are in storage. It's incestuous. I can't tell you the rest. Last time I actually wrote a resume, I think we just get to know each other, and was very fortunate to have that introduction, and sat at a conference room table with Ken, the principal, his two sons, Jack and Nathan, and we just talked for a couple of hours about how we would kind of approach different things. And it was, hey, when can you start? And they said, do you want a contract? And I said, look, I guarantee I'll fire you before you fire me. And Ken kind of laughed at that and said, you're my kind of guy. And I've been very, very blessed to have been working with them now since I think 2009. And we're
If
we're
my
flat.
research is correct, 17 years going on now.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this, right? Obviously, the company you're with, more family office than investment. It's not a PE group. You're not a merchant developer. What's that been like for you to be able to have that kind of a backing in what you're doing in the industry?
Yeah, I think it's great. Again, different challenges, different focus, obviously, than perhaps just somebody who's using other people's money to go and do merchant development. And I don't say that as it's a bad thing. Obviously, it's one channel. We have certain return thresholds. When you're developing for grandchildren and things like that. Now, not an opportunity for too many misses. That said, we sit at a table once a week, and we do literal back of the envelope stuff. I mean, we write on Post-it notes and things like that. And if something costs $10 million and you can make $1 million, and now it's 10%. Oh, it sounds pretty good, and then we go to the next step. So yeah, not a lot of red tape, deal with decision makers, on everything we do. And we're not just for storage. We'll do other types of deals. We have retail holdings. We have a number of buildings in the city of New York where actually the city's our tenant. So we call them community use facilities. And we really like those as well. They can be challenging, but we're small and fairly nimble organization. So we can kind of, deal with some of the headaches that come along with that.
You brought it up, so I'm going to go down the road and fascinated by a couple aspects of this. I'm going to start with the choice to stay in New York City and the immediate surrounding area, right? All of your Treasure Island properties, either in the city or immediate suburbs of the city. I got into this industry in 2021. And of course, the wave of like, let's go to the Sunbelt and build was happening with
Sure.
development. You guys avoided that. How thankful are you today that you stayed true to like staying in New York City? And what made that a principle you guys stuck with?
Yeah, again, I think if you look back to how the family invested early, and when I say early, in the 70s and 80s, long before my time, they invested in what they knew, what was in their backyard. I mean, they were merchants, they were retailers by nature. Where else to kind of do that better than in New York City? And then developing a brand, the Treasure Island storage brand. You know, we had obviously some geographical constraints at that time, especially when we were doing development. Um, to go do a one-off, in the Carolinas or in Florida, and then try to maintain that brand, we kind of thought was a little bit of a challenge. We weren't quite open to the third party management side of things at that point just yet. But yeah, so it kind of kept some of the hand constraints on as far as where we would go. But again, we always had, the idea if we can do it here, and there's still good deals to be made, then that's what we would continue doing.
Well, let's talk about this idea of good deals and being able to continue to be made because the landscape has changed markedly, even since 2009, let alone when you first got into Manhattan mini storage. Talk to me a little bit about the challenges today in New York City, especially on the development front, but also just operationally versus when you first got into working with Treasure Island.
Sure, sure. As I said, going back to, we looked at first, before we started developing again, I think, the first step was to kind of get our arms around our existing operations. Okay, let's see what we had. And fortunately there was some fairly low hanging fruit. There were some things that we could do, and implement, whether it was management software and, going to G5 from a web platform and, some of those types of guys to really get a presence going. And we were able to do that. And then, so we said, okay, yeah, this, speaking with the Cayre family, yeah, okay, this is why we got into this business. Okay. And then we started to look to expand the platform a little bit. And yeah, we early, I think in 2011 or 2012, we started developing again, and we had one or two deals that we put together, and one was a conversion, and we did another ground up, and just the momentum kind of hit. But it since that time, and I guess really into the early 2021, 2022, we were still able to do that. There were still the ICAP tax abatement was still available for storage. The zoning constraints weren't quite there that we see today. And unfortunately, I still think, when obviously, yes, we talk about what are the challenges in storage, oversupply, we've heard for years and years, and, things like that. But, I think there's a lot of smart people in the industry, and I think we can kind of navigate those waters. But, the outside factors, whether it's, citywide or local municipalities, and, the things that we don't always have the control over, I think those are really some of the biggest challenges we face from not only a development standpoint, but also now as we're seeing from an operational standpoint, or a city compliance type of standpoint.
I'm going to dive in a little bit about the challenges now because of this legislation that's changed a little bit, but explain for people who aren't New York City storage people what ICAP was and how, or is really, because it still applies to a bunch of other commercial real estate sectors. For some reason, they chose storage to pull it away from. But explain what the ICAP abatement was and how it's impacting.
Sure. Now, it was an industrial and commercial real estate tax abatement program where you would apply for it as you were entering into a development deal. And just so everybody knows, in New York City, you buy a piece of property, and in 30 or 45 days, there's no contingencies for approvals, and you're buying, that's on you, so you have to move pretty quickly.
You don't get 270-day due diligence period and a 70, 80-day permitting, and
no.
that's
So you're
too
buying,
funny.
you're buying, and you're carrying the cost pretty quickly. But the program was pretty robust, and it was set up to incentivize developers to come in and develop, commercial and industrial type properties. And, commercial is pretty broad, category, but, there were certain quadrants and certain areas within the 5 boroughs where there were different abatement programs. Okay. There wasn't a whole lot in Manhattan. But in other areas, they ranged anywhere from 15 to 25-year abatements. And basically, you would file with the Department of Finance, and you would demonstrate that you're, going out and you're doing outreach, and you're trying to hire, minority, women-owned based businesses to do some of the scopes of work and things like that, which we did. And we always complied with that. And then basically, they would cap the taxes on all of your new improvements. Basically they'd hit you for like 10% and then cap it for the next 15 to 25 years. So, when you look at a $500,000 tax bill in New York City going to, 90,000 or 100,000 for, the next 20, that to what that cap rate, that just goes right to the bottom. And it was a phenomenal tool. And unfortunately, without it, most development deals in New York City just don't underwrite now. If you're now starting out day one without a single customer, and you're seeing, taxes of,
$40,000 a month.
It's tough. It's a tough pill to swallow. And while we're talking about it, just is unfortunately another target of the city on storages. I mean, they just 2026, they just reassessed or raised the assessment of the class of building that storage E7, which is the building class that most storage facilities fall under, by 35%. They raised the assessment. So you still have the abatement and you don't quite feel it, but that basis is starting to get up there. So as that, abatement does, slowly tick away or start to be, slowly phase back in, you can feel the pinch of that. And we're not, we obviously, everybody challenges their taxes, and that's kind of up to the, individual owner or operator to, to go that, pick their route that they want to go with that. But, we can't understand the justification of why that particular building class was singled out. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of mid-block office buildings that are struggling. There's still some vacancies in other asset classes in the city for sure. But, it seems like, that one was picked to kind of carry, the weight for some of the other guys not performing as well.
It's fascinating to me because, New York City, if you obviously I look at development projects all around the country, and if you look at square foot per capita in New York City, it's so tiny compared to almost anywhere else in the country. And rates reflect that, right? Rates are incredible. I was looking at a project in the Bronx out the Bruckner Expressway this week. They've got 11 square foot per capita in a 1 mile, which is unheard of in New York City. And they're still getting $35 a square foot on a 10 by 10 because of the mass population there. My point here is ultimately what happens if there's not more storage being built in New York City is the residents are going to pay for it. They clearly want to use storage, right? Because the vacancy rates are incredibly low in the city, and they're paying really good rates for it. It's kind of like cut off your nose to spite your face, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it really kind of started back in, the de Blasio administration, and when they were starting to kind of carve out certain zoning classifications and special districts. And, we worked with city planning, and, they kind of bought into our argument, that, we're not really an industrial use. We don't need to be in the residential areas, but we should be residential adjacent, right? Those are the people that want to use our service. And, at that point, we were also in the heat of the valet storage business. So, there was a lot of thought that that was going to be the future of New York City for storage people. They were going to pack their stuff up. Somebody was going to pick it up, take it out to the swamps of New Jersey in a big warehouse somewhere, or upstate New York. And, they weren't going to, utilize all this high valued real estate, or so it was perceived, in New York City, where, some factory might want to come in and, build an 8-story factory, if you could believe such a thing. But, so their basis behind it wasn't all that rational. And obviously, while some of the, valet folks are still around, we've obviously seen that temper itself down a bit. And, people want access to their stuff when they want it. And that's the beauty of self-storage. It's your unit, your lock, your key.
Yeah. Fascinating that just never caught on. There's, so many people that live in New York City love the fact that they can have someone at their door at 2 o'clock in the morning to do anything they want. But taking a packet of boxes away was not something that they bought into. Fascinating. And this drives me into the next topic of conversation that I wanted to get into with you. We're seeing the registration law now. I think it goes into effect in August, where anyone who's operating self-storage within New York City now has to register with the city. What has that process been like, and what kind of challenge is it putting on the backs of operators in New York City?
So, the timing of that is appropriate. I mean, we're in the midst of it right now. So it first came around, and yeah, it's a business license requirement basically, and it's governed by the DCWP, which is the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, agency, which used to be Department of Consumer Affairs. So they're really the governing agency. So when the bills first came out last, in I think June or July of 2025, our association, we jumped right on it. We have a lobbying firm that we use in New York City. And we were able to get, audience with the sponsors of the bills. And, the way they were first written, we didn't really care for. We thought they were very negative, and really would have hampered, self-storage operators. I mean, they really had a lot of rent control language in there, and some other requirements that didn't really make sense. And, we were able to get to the sponsor, council member Menon at the time, and say, look, we don't really object to a business license. I mean, I operate storage facilities in parts of New Jersey where, you get a mercantile license, or you get a business license from the local municipality. Not really, an overreach there. But, kind of what their thoughts were originally on why they wanted it, we thought were, didn't make a whole lot of sense, a little bit misguided. But we get two bills that ended up being passed, and they really were not overly taxing the way the laws were written, which takes us into the process where we are right now, which is the rulemaking process. So this is where, okay, the DCWP now has the laws, and it's their job to now implement and then put together a set of rules by which the agency is going to govern it going forward. Well, we got the list of rules, and they were published back in April 10th or 15th or something, and we nearly fell out of a window when we first read it, because they contain requirements for a business license that are we've never seen before. We can't understand justifications behind it. And I don't want to go in to the blood and guts of all the rules now, because we are working back now with our lobbyists. We are going back to some of the original bill sponsor, to say, hey, what the heck happened here? This really isn't, we were a partner with you, we want to be good citizens. We think it's good business. Taking care of New Yorkers, is part of our business, and we think it's good for us. So, there are some challenges going on right now. There is the agency, which I know a lot of our, listeners probably know, has brought a lawsuit against one of the REITs, and they're in the midst of fighting that. So we're in a very awkward period right now. And, we're putting together our defenses and our rationale for why these things should be amended. And, quite frankly, I don't want to go into too much detail now, because, we are meeting with, city officials and agency officials and things like that. And they have been willing to meet with us and have these discussions. So just, we will continue, and we're going to press that. And, we want to deliver something back that we think makes sense from what the original intent of the law as it was written to how it gets rolled out and implemented. And then obviously, the oversight that the agency will have for the years to come.
This goes to a greater point that I talked to you off camera before, that I talk about a lot, especially on the other podcast I do, Storage Unlocked, which is much more newsy than this, which is a little more personal, but especially with you because of the role you're playing. I think it's so important right now. We haven't even really touched on the incredible consolidation, right? I brought up Alex Burnham early on, and Manhattan Mini Storage, which is now a part of Storage Mart. Public Storage just announced they're buying NSA. We're seeing that across the industry. And for me, one of the big things, and maybe one of the hidden things that I'm concerned about with that, is the effect it has on local SSA organizations, right? State level SSA organizations, you particularly in the New York SSA as a greater whole, and your lobbyist are critical in making sure that we see these things happening, right? That somebody has to be paying attention and see what's going on. So I guess the question I have for you here is, how critical is it right now that people in the industry get involved?
It's tremendously, and to take one step back. Well, yes, we have seen some of the bigger guys get bigger and so forth. As speaking with my association cap on now, I have to say, we've had a tremendous partnership with Tim Dietz and Joe Doherty down at National SSA. I mean, they've been tremendous guys to work with, and anything as a state association that we run ourselves, they've supported us, whether it's data or it's financing, or if we're fighting a particular challenge. And with that relationship also then comes a great relationship with Public Storage and Extra Space and Cube Smart, and then obviously some of the bigger Manhattan Mini Storage. I mean, Adam, who's COO, sits on our board, and we have Safeguard and Storage, so we're pretty well represented by those guys. But when we used to go in and talk to local politicians, we say, hey, look, you always say you're promoting small businesses, small business owners. And I would say, well, the bulk of self-storage guys, we're small business owners ourselves. And not only are we the small business owners, we also promote and assist other small business owners getting their businesses up off the ground. So, I don't know if, the industry and a lot of our operators are really looked at in that lens anymore by policymakers, state legislators, or local government individuals. I think they see a lot of headlines that a certain portfolio traded at X billion dollars, and all of a sudden, I think there's a bit of a target put out there. But I get asked a lot, that especially when we go to different conferences and different parts of the state, what can I, from an operator, maybe it's a mom and pop, or maybe it's a smaller regional that has a couple of what can I do as an operator? And first thing I always say is be a good operator. And you can take that for what is kind of a subjective statement, but I say be a good operator. Do things. If you have an issue with a consumer, make sure they know how the heck to get you before it gets too far. And I say know your local politicians, your local policymakers, whether it's at the municipal level, whether it's at the state level, because nobody from the federal government, at least knock on wood right now, seems to really be coming after us. But it's, the state and local municipal legislators that can put zoning regulations in. They can try to put, we just see where in Maryland, one of the counties is trying to add a sin tax for $5,000 per storage facility now. So they can add those things, and that can be a lot more meaningful, or much more, I should say, detrimental to our businesses than what the federal government can do. I mean, how our people deal with their own personal taxes and stuff, that's on them. But it's becoming more and more of a challenge. And, we say, look, get out in front of these people. Let them know who you are. Let them know that you are a small business owner, or that, you have an inherent interest in what goes on in and around where your facility is, right? This is a micro market business, and my facility, in that 3 to 5 mile radius, even if I have a couple, you need to be in touch with the people in that trade area, and let them know that you exist, for sure.
I could go so deep down the road with this. I didn't even bring up INT 495, where they proposed a 2% rate cap on storage in New York City, which blows my mind when you talk about a 35% increase in taxes, right? Like, makes no sense logically.
On the assessment, not necessarily the taxes.
I know, but that 35% increase on the assessment is still going to be more than a 2% rate increase would cover in expenses to the. Listen, from my heart, incredibly grateful for what you're doing and the time you're spending. I'm going to switch gears really quickly. And it's a thing that fascinates me with folks like you, who obviously have a more than 40-hour-a-week job just as president of Cayre Equities. Then you're donating time to New York Self-Storage Association and all the great work you do there. What motivates James Coakley? What is it that drives you to be involved in the way that you are?
I think, it was kind of ingrained early on, when I first got into the storage business, working with the folks at Edison Properties and Manhattan Mini Storage. I mean, they really, they were instrumental in starting the association, right? So they saw the benefit, back in the early 80s or mid 80s when it first came out, and, making sure that there was somebody that could advocate on behalf of the industry. And, I know I'm up front and I'm doing a lot of the preaching and these things from time to time, but, we have a tremendous board for the New York Association, and we're really blessed to have a lot of the people that there, and they do, our annual conferences, our upstate conferences, the content, and the people, the speakers, the panelists that are coming. I mean, we're kind of beyond the, hey, what's the top term in your occupancy agreement, or, how do I, sweep my, units out more effectively? I mean, people are there and they have real business questions, and we try to address them. So, people like Adam and who sits on our board, and we have representation from Keep Smart and Extra Space,
Stan Bonilla and Rana Siegel and Guy Middlebrooks and Zach Dickens. You guys are just loaded with
No,
players
so
in the industry.
it's a great board, and it's a privilege to work with them. And everybody puts in that kind of time because I think they understand the benefit of it. And I mean, maybe it's because we're a little bit selfish on how we want to see our businesses perform, but at the end of the day, when it's a good environment, for all businesses, then I think, we can all benefit from that. And, we all compete and we all want, the customers and market share and things like that. But we also want a bit of a level playing field for those things that, we can control. Those things that are getting out of our control now are getting a little bit more of a challenge on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I'll say that having spent about 5 years in this industry now and having spent 25 years in other businesses before I got into storage, I feel blessed to have gotten into this industry. It's something special. And folks like you and the other members of the board of the New York Self Storage Association, the way you guys operate with people, you took the time back in October at the event in Westchester to take some time to tape an interview with me, which you didn't have to do in any way, shape, or form. You didn't even know me before that. I think Stan Bonilla introduced us maybe a couple minutes earlier.
Yeah.
Just from me to you, thank you for the way you operate. Thank you for the way you carry yourself and the work that you do and what you do to help keep our industry as special as it is, even with some of the challenges that we're facing. Can't thank you enough for being who you are and taking 30 minutes to come and share the story with me.
No, it's great. I have a great platform. I appreciate the opportunity. And, you just rattled off 5, 6, 7 names of people. And I think that speaks volumes for the industry that we've all found ourselves in, luckily, because, guy like Stan, we've competed for the same piece of dirt for years and years, but we can sit at a table together and say, hey, this is what's really best for the industry, and kind of collaborate on that regard. So, it is a privilege.
Something that still makes me amazed and why I find this industry so special and humbled that I have this little piece of it that I get to contribute to. And all those members I mentioned, by the way, have been on this podcast before. I now got you here, except Zach Dickens, and he's coming up later in May. So excited to get him on board too. He's awesome. James Coakley, president of Cayre Equities and Treasure Island Storage, past president of the New York Self Storage Association. One more quick shout out to our friends at Kiwi 2 Construction, simply the best crews in steel for self-storage. And now a lot of small bay flex as well. They've been doing that for more than a decade. If you've got a ground up development project, you cannot be in better hands than with Wayne Woolsey and his team at Kiwi 2. KiwiConstruction.com. Get them involved early. Take advantage of 30 plus years of experience in putting up steel buildings. He's James Coakley. I'm Thaddeus Campbell. That's it for this week's edition of Stories Behind the Door podcast. We'll see you next week.
Take care, Thad. Thanks.